when was the last time anybody saw us beating China in a trade deal?
While two of the world's biggest economies have been sparring over trade tariffs in the ongoing US-China trade war, one country has been winning big.
Vietnam's been a particular beneficiary of this. I think it's probably the largest beneficiary in Southeast Asia.
But the world is grappling with the increasing spread and adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. How much will it hurt Vietnam's economy?
The coronavirus is going to be a negative because it's going to impact imports from China, and of course China also a big contributor to the Vietnamese economy through buying goods that it sells, but particularly through tourism.
About 30% of its tourism receipts is from China, and that has actually been wiped out in the last couple of weeks, right? And that in turn has repercussions for the other parts of the economy because of the multiplier effect.
As a nation that's heavily dependent on China, will COVID-19 put the brakes on Vietnam's growth? Or is Vietnam's economy better positioned today for a bounce back? It's the most significant black swan of 2020 that is set to wreak havoc on the global economy. The disease, COVID-19, within a very short span of 3 months, has set off a global transmission chain. It has hit at least 110 countries, with over 118,000 cases reported worldwide and nearly 4,300 deaths. It has thrown the world in a vortex of fear and sent financial markets into a tailspin. It all began in December 2019 with inadequate information about the exact nature of the disease.
When China first reported this outbreak to WHO and then to the rest of the world, the number of cases was not very high. I think it was just 41 cases at that time. And the nature of the report was such that many of us felt that it was just like SARS. And because it was just like SARS, which means that it doesn't transmit so well, but it was quite fatal, the impression that Wuhan will be able to control it and things will come back to normal very quickly. But what we found subsequently was that there was information that was suppressed at Wuhan and Hubei, and that only finally made it out, including like many people that have been infected but not reported in the first place.
Within Hubei province, there have been some clear failings. The most important one being they were too slow to address the outbreak and to let the public know that it was going on and to put in place the kind of measures that could have stopped it at an earlier stage. So there are some questions that are being asked in China and outside of China about how the incentives of local officials to bring issues up early, and then also the implications of impeded information flow based on China's political system.
When we see that the outbreak has happened in Wuhan, it probably started sometime in October, and now it seems to be starting to come down. That's the normal parts of any type of epidemic. The cases climb, and as we impose interventions, or even if we don't, they start to come down. But when the virus is exported to another country, then the process starts again. So for many countries, or many regions of the world where there is this virus, we are kind of at the starting points where Wuhan was.
So while COVID-19 may have essentially peaked in Wuhan and in China, every other country it hits will face its own peak. And that's the worrying part, as the virus today has travelled across the globe, with different countries reporting spikes in new infections. The WHO has called for the need for global cooperation and for countries to take urgent and aggressive action to turn the course of the COVID-19 pandemic.
If we close down schools or if we close down factories, for instance, that also cuts down the transmission of the virus between people, and so you can reduce the number of cases. But obviously all these measures cannot be done for long because there are other knock-on consequences in terms of how it impacts the economy, how it impacts people's livelihood.
This is not the first and it will not be the last. In fact, the bubonic plague in Europe, which killed almost 2/3 of the population, was a result of the Silk Road in those days. But of course, when the Silk Road was closed and trade declined, the global economy declined as well. So in that sense, you can't help it, because if there's more air travel, there's more interaction between people from different countries, we will spread the diseases as well.
And as the disease spreads, there will be more lockdowns causing disruptions to industrial production and global trade flows. COVID-19 has already begun to have serious implications for the global economy. The IMF reports that the overall impact is likely to lower China's real GDP growth rate to approximately 5.9% in December 2020, a decrease from 6% the previous year. And how does this affect Vietnam, one of the trade war's biggest winners?
Vietnam is very dependent upon China, and this is why it is vulnerable to impacts from coronavirus. Vietnam is reliant upon China for about 30% of its electronics imports. So these are components that Vietnamese factories are importing from China, say for local assembly before the finished product, like a Samsung phone, is sent elsewhere. So 30% of its components are coming in from China in the electronics sector. Wuhan is an important electronics manufacturing hub, and outbound shipments have been affected due to the factory shutdowns as a result of the quarantine measures. That has been having an impact on Vietnam.
With component manufacturing in China still in varying degrees of shutdown, Vietnam's factories are expected to run out of parts over the coming weeks and months.
Because number one, the factories didn't reopen for a while. Number two, they have reopened, but they're not running at full capacity because they don't have enough workers yet. Or number three, they are still making those components or products, but the logistics of getting the things here, whether it's air cargo or other things, have slowed down or become impossible.
The trade data for the beginning of 2020 was very weak, so overall trade in Vietnam was down by about 12% in January, and I would expect similar numbers in February and March, on the assumption that the coronavirus outbreak is brought under control by the end of March. We'll then still continue to see a soft second quarter, but probably by June, things will be returning back to normal.
Many manufacturers in Vietnam are struggling to secure the raw materials they need to remain operational. Walter Blocker founded Vietnam Trade Alliance in 1994. It's one of the first American consumer-based companies to set up in Vietnam right when the trade embargo was lifted. His businesses are starting to feel the pinch of the COVID-19 outbreak.
Our shipments into Vietnam, and it's not perfectly measured yet, but they're down about 50%. Now, part of that is the halo from our Tet holiday, from our Tet period, Chinese New Year. We call it Tet in Vietnam. And second is the fact that a lot of things aren't flowing, which will delay factories running in full production potentially. Many of them, we believe, will not have the components they need to run continuously, and that will interrupt the supply chain as a knock-on effect.
Vietnam Trade Alliance is a holding firm with 9 operating companies in businesses that include furniture, beer and beverage, food, insurance, advertising, and digital consumer research. And with such a vast portfolio, it's a mixed bag when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on his businesses.
For our beer business, people are gathering less, spending less time in traditional venues where in our tropical climate people like to enjoy being together. Now, we've been fortunate because other parts of the business have picked up from that, but for sure our beverage business has been affected. Our energy drink business has been affected because people have been delayed going back to work. Our furniture business today sources much of its componentry from non-China sources, so we've been able to run production there, and the demand for our furniture hasn't been affected. Our research company has also received many inquiries. We're doing a lot of deep dive analysis in the population to understand what the mental effect of this is.
Despite all this, Walter Blocker hopes that COVID-19 may just be causing a brief setback for Vietnam. He thinks that the country is resilient and is sure to bounce back to capitalize on the gains of the trade war.
Vietnam has the largest trading relationship with the United States than any other country in Southeast Asia. When I was a young chairman of the American Chamber in 2001, two-way trade between the U.S. and Vietnam was $1.5 billion. Last year, it was closer to $60 billion. That's amazing growth.
China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 sparked its rapid growth, making it the world's factory. The country today thrives as a manufacturing powerhouse, and its economy has become integrated into global value chains since 2003. It is the most important industrial producer, as it sells more manufacturing goods than any other country in the world.
China has a dominant position in global supply chains. This is because of China's history of having low wages when we had the very high levels of rural-urban migration, that export-based manufacturing in the coast. China, like Vietnam, also had a very good education system, so the quality of workers you were getting for the wage rate was very strong and very attractive for international manufacturers. At the same time, globalization meant that international transport costs were coming down as a share of the product price, and China has this large domestic market, which also makes it attractive.
But the dominance of China in manufacturing became the Trump administration's biggest problem. And Trump targeted the US trade deficit with China, which grew to about $375 billion in 2017. According to Trump, this was hindering US economic growth. So he made reducing the trade deficit a priority by promoting the Buy American policy.
We are going to make our country great again.
Since 2018, the US and China have been locked in a bitter trade battle, and the diplomatic relations between two of the world's largest economies has gone downhill. The dispute has seen the US and China impose tariffs on billions of dollars worth of one another's goods.
America's had a trade deficit for 40 straight years. It has a trade deficit with 98 countries bilaterally, long before China became a global power. Obviously, China did not cause this trade problem. A country has a trade deficit because it spends more than it produces. It borrows. And why does America borrow so much? It's because American households don't save much. They spend beyond their income levels.
It's a view that having this trade deficit with other countries means that there's less employment and manufacturing profits that they can obtain from having it within the US. I think it's very much, it's part of his trade policy, part of his sort of platform of, make America great again, improve that sort of manufacturing sector. So hence there's been that sort of very big focus on trade, and it's quite popular, at least in terms of, the moves he's made with China.
It's a bit misleading, of course, to gauge trade policy just on simple surpluses or deficits overall, and a lot of that comes down to how you measure the value of that trade.
The US trade tariffs in Trump's trade war came in multiple stages over the course of 2 years. And Trump was emboldened by America's economic strength and China's economic slowdown and was prepared to tax all imports.
This trade war is also misguided. People think it's about trade, they think it's about manufacturing. It's actually about getting China to open up or liberalize its services. A more open China would allow much more investment in services in China, and Americans have a comparative advantage in that area, and that is a key issue.
But even as Trump's measures were increasingly hurting China, and as a knock-on effect, damaging the global economy, Vietnam emerged as a clear winner in the long drawn-out trade war.
So when the trade war started, first Vietnam was already well positioned, not only geographically because of its proximity to China, but also because of the openness of the country, of the government towards foreign investors.
Vietnam has followed the traditional development path that has seen many East Asian economies grow their way from lower to middle, and then in some cases up to upper middle or even just upper income status. Started off as a very agriculturally driven economy with a big surplus labour force in rural areas. They moved into urban areas, from the informal into the formal sector, and then there was a large labour force willing to work at a low wage, and so we had a lot of labour-intensive manufacturing coming along.
This is a function of Vietnam's young population, large labor force comparative to other countries in Southeast Asia, and the relatively good infrastructure that Vietnam has, particularly around the southern city of Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, and also in the north in the corridor that stretches between Hanoi and the port city of Haiphong. These have really emerged as two industrial beltways or industrial corridors that have been really attractive to foreign businesses moving to Vietnam.
Vietnam is seen as an economy and society very, very similar to China. For example, it's communist, it's one-party rule. It's also, in terms of organization, Confucianistic. Vietnam has a young population. They've just emerged from a couple of decades of deprivation as a result of the wars against the US and the French. Also, they have had a lot of investments coming in from China as well. And the economic cooperation between Vietnam and China has been very helpful to a large extent too.
The economy of Vietnam, with a population of around 96 million, has improved by almost 8% because of the shift in production resulting from the US-China trade war. The country's proximity to China is particularly suitable for companies that want to move manufacturing operations to Vietnam. Instead of abandoning the Chinese market, investors are choosing to supplement Chinese operations with low-cost inputs sourced from production facilities in Vietnam. This production model has become widely known as China Plus One strategy.
The companies had a lot of supply chain exposure just to the China market or the China geography. So there has been a desire to maybe have a diversification in place so that if something happened in China, that you had a backup option. And also recognition that as China's wages were rising so fast, it was going to not be as cost competitive in the future as it was at the time. So Vietnam was one of those economies that many firms looked at because it had a lot of the similar characteristics to China. In many ways, it was easier to do business in Vietnam as a foreign firm than a local firm, and there's not many countries where it's that way around.
It's all about not putting all your eggs in one basket. It's about having China still as a very strong part of the value chain, but it's about not being completely entirely dependent on China. It's not just China plus one in Vietnam. It would be, for a lot of companies, it would be China plus three. And I think, again, if we put everything in the context of this changing world that's being influenced by more geopolitics, by what I call techno-nationalism when we're talking about the technology sector, a lot of these companies that are looking at a China plus one, China plus two strategy are going to have to figure out how to become regional and local companies in all their key markets around the world.
And are looking at what they can do here or looking at expanding what they can do here. So I think business is going to keep growing, and a lot of it is built on the back of the political and economic stability we have seen here in Vietnam. The currency is incredibly stable versus the US dollar. Growth is strong, inflation is low, the workforce is smart and hardworking and kind of a sweet spot demographically. There's no question that Vietnam's kind of stability and integration in the world economy, that's going to continue, and I think that that gives a lot of confidence to companies and investors that are looking at Vietnam.
Vietnam's education and infrastructure are better suited to assembly and relatively low value-add manufacturing than many of the higher value-added processes becoming popular in mainland China. Foreign investors often choose to enter the Vietnamese market gradually as a result of these limitations. Basic components or assembly are usually the first aspects of the production to be outsourced to Vietnam.
For them to actually take that growth to the next level, they need to actually be conscious of the fact that increasingly the country will probably need to open up its markets a little bit more. Like, for example, ease up on the capital controls. Right, the Vietnamese dong. Now it's easy. It's not so it's easy to actually invest in Vietnam, but when you want to exit, it is not that straightforward. So they need to actually make sure that investors have an exit plan at the end of the day to be able to exit and therefore actually get the investments out as well. But I would say that Vietnam has been replicating the China success story quite successfully to that extent.
The majority of Vietnam's gains came from exports of goods covered by US tariffs on China, especially those businesses that could swiftly relocate to factories outside China. Exports to the US jumped by 34.8% in the first 9 months of 2019. The country's GDP remained robust at 7%, the highest in Southeast Asia, as per official government figures. It has attracted a plethora of multinational companies, including Intel, Samsung and LG, all of which have made huge investments.
We talk about Vietnam's export success story. I mean, a big chunk of that is actually Samsung's manufacturing export success story in Vietnam. And South Korean companies have been very, very big investors, not just Samsung, but others as well, in Vietnam. And so it has moved into that electronics sector with close linkages into supply chains in South Korea and also supply chains in China.
Looking forward, Vietnam's government has in place a number of policies to try and encourage continued investment in higher value manufacturing. I think there are two ways this will manifest itself. The first is increasing investment in supply chains. Right now, Vietnam is still very dependent on China and other countries in Southeast Asia for many of the components that are used in the manufacturing processes here. The other place I think that manufacturing will be continuing to take off is in the auto sector.
There's a lot of competition to be automotive manufacturing hubs because automotive is a sector that kind of tugs at the heartstrings a bit more. It gets a lot of government subsidy in other places, but as a result, the automotive market is oversupplied globally, and so automotive manufacturing plants have actually been struggling for profitability. So it's been a sensible move for Vietnam to focus on the electronics sector, which has, of course, partly been a deliberate choice, but also been the result of Samsung's very big investment.
With more investments coming in and more companies moving manufacturing to Vietnam, production in the country went into overdrive. In June 2019, Vietnam drew the ire of the Trump administration because of its growing trade surplus with the US. And it very much looked like it would be Trump's next target for increased tariffs.
I would assume that Trump's fixation with trade deficits goes back decades, and his frame of reference, which is a very zero-sum frame of reference when it comes to trade. It's a very mercantilist kind of view of trade. You know, you're either winning or you're losing, and you win by having a surplus.
The Trump administration had Vietnam in its sights due to its rising trade surplus with the United States. In June 2019, Trump described Vietnam as the single worst abuser of everybody. This led to mounting speculation that Vietnam could be the next battleground for Trump.
Vietnam, of course, has become a transit point, if you will, or a transshipment point for goods from China as well. So if you look at the trade flows and the exports from Vietnam immediately following the imposition of tariffs in the U.S.-China trade war, there was a huge bump in exports. So the question was, well, how much of that was actually manufactured or goods that were substantially transformed and actually were truly of country of origin Vietnam, and how many of those goods were actually just transshipped and relabeled. So the transshipment issue obviously got the attention of Washington.
Their deficit with Vietnam has increased significantly. It's actually about $56 billion at the moment. It's increased by about 50% over the last year. And so it's even surpassed Ireland. So they've taken notice of that, and of course for the Trump administration, how the size of their bilateral trade deficit is quite important. Vietnam's government's very conscious of this. They've been saying that they're going to increase their vigilance and surveillance of this.
In the first half of 2019, Vietnam's trade surplus with the US rose 39% to $25.3 billion. And in July, the US slapped tariffs of more than 400% on steel imports from Vietnam, saying they originated in Taiwan and South Korea.
The rationale for tariffs on Vietnam are largely due to two factors. One is the perception that Vietnam is a currency manipulator, and the second is the trade deficit. However, in the most recent U.S. Treasury Department report on currency manipulation, Vietnam was considered to only be meeting one of the three, that is the trade deficit, categorizations for a currency manipulator. So if anything, the U.S.-Vietnam relationship has actually been strengthened, and these concerns from the U.S. side about currency manipulation, which are linked to the trade deficit, have actually diminished since last November.
Vietnam has been a strong security supporter for the US in Asia, so that's given it a support base in the Washington DC establishment, particularly the defense establishment. And then also the focus has just been very much on China, and then because Vietnam has been the alternative supplier, it's meant that the US has been able to sanction Chinese exports but still have another place to get supply into the US. So Vietnam's been safe so far.
The US was Vietnam's biggest export market, followed by the EU and China. However, Vietnam also spent $57.98 billion on importing goods in the first quarter of 2019, up 8.9%.
You can see in recent visits by President Trump, there have been a number of trade deals signed with Boeing jets, often the headline of these events. And this kind of growing the two-way relationship initiatives is very likely to continue. In the long run, I think Vietnam and the United States agree that imported United States liquid natural gas is a long-term answer to this question. It addresses a number of strategic needs for Vietnam in terms of electricity generation.
Soon after Trump's statement, Vietnam inked billions in purchases from Boeing and General Electric, seeking to rein in its trade surplus with the US. But there's a limit to how much Vietnam can purchase from the United States.
Vietnam knows that there are things it can do besides just balancing trade that'll also make the White House happier, and that is some of these kind of nuisance rules and regulations that have been creating market access problems for American companies. Vietnam's been working very hard to listen to the concerns of the U.S. business community and of the Trump administration, and to try to make some progress in those areas, which we've seen, but we expect to see more progress. So while there's not a $50 billion check they can go out and write, they certainly can do things to take a big bite out of that structural trade deficit and show that they're making progress and heading in the right direction.
Vietnam continues to attract record foreign direct investment. It's one of the world's top investment destinations. According to data from Vietnam's Foreign Investment Agency, FDI in Vietnam in the first 5 months of 2019 reached a 4-year high of $16.74 billion, an increase of 69%.
Vietnam's attractiveness as an investment destination is driven by both its attractiveness as a manufacturing site, but also the growing consumer market that Vietnam represents. You know, remember, Vietnam is approaching 100 million citizens. It's no longer a lower income country, but a fast-growing lower middle income country that has the goal of becoming a middle income country within the next 10 to 15 years. So there's a lot of enthusiasm both for Vietnam as a manufacturing and export site, but also as a market in and of itself.
It's important when we're thinking about FDI inflows that you can't just build a factory instantly. So over the last 5 years, we've actually seen that FDI inflows have grown by, on average, into the manufacturing sector by about 11% per annum. So that's still a strong number. In fact, looking at a scorecard, when we're looking at the region of FDI attractiveness, we actually rank Vietnam as #1.
They're looking to attract clean, sustainable, green, high-value FDI that really helps Vietnam manufacturing make a jump to the next level.
Most importantly, Vietnam's free trade agreements are set to provide a huge boost to its economy. Over the past few years, Vietnam has been active in signing bilateral trade agreements with countries throughout the world. The latest was a landmark free trade deal with the European Union.
Vietnam's export profile is very, very different from the EU's export profile, and therefore there is no cannibalization anyway in either direction. So it will be a lot more positive for Vietnam, given the fact that its economy is so much more smaller than the EU, and therefore, and with the opening of the EU via the free trade agreement, it gives Vietnam access to a much bigger market with lower tariffs, and therefore that's going to be very, very positive for Vietnamese exports. The TPP would have been a huge boost for Vietnam because, based on our studies, we felt that Vietnam was actually the biggest beneficiary of the TPP. But unfortunately, that has been shelved, and therefore, the RCEP, in turn, is not going to be as big a beneficiary for Vietnam.
The EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement is a deep free trade agreement. The CPTPP is a deep free trade agreement. We're at a point now where supply chains are becoming more and more automated, where technology is being used more and more to achieve transparency within supply chains, or what I call the 5 T's, right? Transparency, truth, trust, technology, of course, and talent, right? So all of these things are needed now to properly manage cross-border trade and cross-border value chains. And we're seeing now a convergence of these new values baked into these FTAs with the emergence of new technologies that are going to allow the management, the verification of these standards. And that, incidentally, is a huge business opportunity.
One of the reasons why Vietnam can still be considered quite an attractive destination for FDI inflows, and why we actually think that growth will remain quite healthy, is actually it's part of ASEAN, and as part of ASEAN, it also means that it's actually benefiting from these trade agreements that are being negotiated. Of interest, though, of course, is always going to be about we've got the goods. Vietnam is going to have more markets being open to it. It's what actually can open up in terms of the services as well.
Vietnam's GDP has been experiencing positive growth since 2014 and is projected to continue to do so through 2024. But the COVID-19 outbreak could potentially put the brakes on Vietnam's phenomenal growth. How much can it hurt Vietnam's economy?
Every day, everyone's losing money.
Vietnam has many trade advantages over China. Labour costs are cheaper, and the country is a signatory to many bilateral trade agreements. And despite its trade surplus with the United States, the Trump administration thus far has been pleased with Vietnam's multi-billion-dollar purchases of American goods. Can Vietnam be the next China?
No. I don't think Vietnam can become the next China simply because it doesn't have the scale. China has massive scale. China has been building infrastructure for 3 decades now. China has very, very intense critical mass when it comes to certain sectors within the global value chain.
So if somebody comes here and they say, I'm making 2 million shoes a year, where can I set up where all of a sudden I can just get 50,000 workers? And that's not so easy. You know, we say, well, 8,000, 10,000, no problem, but 50,000, much more of a challenge. And as people look around, they realize, hey, this is why we were doing this in China. It made sense for companies to be there.
China is about 29 times bigger than Vietnam, and its population of nearly 1.4 billion is no match for Vietnam's 96 million. Vietnam is roughly the same size as China's most populous southern manufacturing base of Guangdong province, that has a population of around 113 million. According to the Guangdong Statistics Bureau, the province alone accounted for 58% of the total workforce in 2018.
So Vietnam is never going to have that same dual attraction of an export manufacturing base with a very attractive domestic market to service as well. The Vietnamese market is much smaller, partly that's about population, but it's also about just very low levels of GDP per capita. So for those companies manufacturing in Vietnam, they're not really that concerned about the domestic market. So that's a big difference from China. I think Vietnam has already replicated China's export model pretty successfully.
Since January 2020, owing to the COVID-19 outbreak, the trade war winner is set to lose billions of dollars. As Vietnam's economy is dependent on China's, the country has already begun to feel the pinch. Many factories have been unable to get raw materials from China, and with borders closed, exports of goods to China have suffered as well.
Beyond manufacturing, the agriculture, a large chunk of Vietnam's agricultural exports are sent to China. There were stories in the Vietnamese media in recent days of over 600 containers of Vietnamese agricultural products being stuck at the northern border because they weren't being allowed to cross. So there's a real challenge there for agricultural producers. Dragon fruit is a particular export that is very popular in China and is grown across much of southern Vietnam, and that's having a particular tough time. And then the third sector beyond manufacturing and agriculture that I would speak about is tourism.
The disruption will come from tourism because Vietnam's tourism is very dependent on China. In fact, about 30% of its tourism receipts is from China, and that has actually been wiped out in the last couple of weeks, right? And that in turn has repercussions for the other parts of the economy because of the multiplier effect. So from that angle, the Vietnamese economy will also slow down by anywhere between 0.5 to 0.8% as a result of lower tourism traffic. And the Chinese tourists are not just biggest in numbers, but they're also by far the biggest spenders in Vietnam.
According to Vietnam's Department of Tourism, the estimated direct damage to the country's tourism industry could reach anywhere from 3 to 4 billion US dollars. But Vietnam is no stranger to handling medical crises. In 2003, at the height of the SARS outbreak, Vietnam pulled all the stops to control the disease. In April that year, the World Health Organization declared Vietnam to be the first nation to contain and eliminate the disease.
Vietnam did something in 2003 that perhaps sounded drastic by today's standards. So in that one hospital where they had SARS cases, they literally locked it down and they stopped anybody from coming in and out. And if you read the reports of those times, the healthcare workers and the patients there were very traumatized by what happened. But because it was in some ways very decisive, even though it might seem a very difficult decision to make today, they were able to contain the outbreak in Vietnam. So there was SARS in 2003.
But the nature of COVID-19 is different from that of SARS, and the impact to the global economy could be more severe, with nearly 110 countries affected and over 118,000 cases reported worldwide. Today, factory lockdowns are disrupting supply chains and resulting in supply shocks.
Vietnam has been one of the world's fastest growing economies for the last couple of years. In the top 5 in 2018, top 5 2019. It's probably not quite going to be top 5 in 2020 due to the coronavirus impacts, but it will probably still be top 10. At the EIU, we're on average over the next 5 years, we expect growth in Vietnam to be about 6.4%, so a very fast rate of growth. In 2020, we were expecting the economy to grow by 6.9%. That's probably now going to be revised downwards to around about 6.2% or so as a result of the disruption in the first quarter due to coronavirus. But that is still a very fast growth rate in a global context.
We think that the coronavirus is going to have largely an impact in Q1. It's going to be similar to SARS, going to be a high impact, short-lived. So we're expecting the majority of impact in Q1 reflecting both lower tourism numbers due to restrictions on the Chinese tourists, but also some global supply chain disruptions. Now we do actually expect that as we move into Q2 that we should actually start to see some normalisation in production.
In 2003, China's GDP was 1.6 trillion. As of last year, China's GDP was 14.8 trillion, almost 10 times the size. And you can't discount that impact. So the impact is huge. Thailand, unfortunately, is going through a very severe phase because it's facing its worst drought in 40 years. And at the same time, its exports last year was affected by the very strong Thai baht and also by the trade dispute between China and the US. Right? And we have not seen a recovery in that at this point in time. And now we get both the virus and the drought happening too. So Thailand as an economy is probably going to be one of the worst hits around this region.
Singapore is very export dependent, and we've already seen that tourism numbers are down, and also the fact that with these supply chains that's impacting their exports as well. So we've also taken GDP down from 1.4% that we were expecting previously to about 1%. For Malaysia again, we've also lowered that from 4.1 to 3.9. Now within these countries what we are seeing is that we're expecting more monetary policy support. In fact, we already saw Thailand reduce rates, as did Philippines as well, but also we're expecting some more fiscal support.
The COVID-19 outbreak is also a grim reminder of the extreme concentration of manufacturing built up in China. The more connected the world is, the more disruptive its functioning gets. A single bottleneck can harm the whole supply chain. So shutting down gigantic plants in China has created a gigantic bottleneck.
I think that a lot of the business that left China is not going to come back to China. I think that what we see right now with the coronavirus, that's not something that is China's fault, but it certainly helps reinforce what a lot of companies already knew, which was it's very risky to rely too much on one country for your supply chain or your business plan. So the people that were diversifying around, the coronavirus is just one more reason that they feel that they should be in a place like Vietnam. And so I think it's a long-term trend that we're going to see continue.
If you have the automation, if you have the technology, if you have the whole ecosystem in place, it makes much more sense to make where you sell. If you can derive benefits from a global economies of scale, great. But if you can pack that all into and cut costs and still get all the benefits of human capital, of automation, of technology, all the stuff in a global value chain that used to be unbundled and placed all over the world, if you can just replicate that in key markets and produce as close to those markets as possible, that's a much better business model.
China accounts for 20% of the world's manufacturing. That's over $2 trillion in output. The COVID-19 outbreak, with an epicenter in Wuhan, China, set in motion a global economic slowdown, and the world is still grappling with how great its impact will be.
The bounce back outside of China will mirror the bounce back within China, because that's the main channel through which the coronavirus economic impact is happening. So I think the bounce backs will largely mirror each other. But outside of China, some of the worst affected economies, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand and Singapore are probably the most affected. A tier below that, places like Australia, where tourism and minerals exports to China are quite important. Same with Korea and Japan. China a very important trading partner, but those economies are very large and quite diversified.
Our hope is that we can see continued improvement day by day in how people view the coronavirus, that this becomes a more normal situation, and that things get to a place where people aren't worried about working in certain places, and that business can continue. Because until that happens, every day everyone's losing money, and it's impossible to think that that's not going to have continued negative impact.